What if the biggest attack in modern American history against another country was never really about that country at all? Stay till the end, because the answer is stranger than anything you have heard on the news this week. Before we go further, if you believe in honest analysis over noisy headlines, hit like right now, subscribe if you are new here, and send this to one person who still thinks this story is simple. It is not. Let's get into it. Here's what actually happened. On the same week, two numbers hit the world at almost the same moment. The United States government debt crossed a level no nation has ever reached before. $40 trillion. Say that slowly. 40 trillion, not 40 billion. 40 trillion. A number so large that the human brain cannot really picture it. If you tried to count to 40 trillion, one number every second, without sleeping, without stopping, it would take you more than 1 million years. On that very same week, the American president announced what he called the harshest economic assault ever launched against a single nation. He used words like crushing, historic, unstoppable. He compared it to a legendary military operation. He said this would be remembered as the moment everything changed for Iran. Almost every news channel treated these two events as separate stories. One business segment about debt, one politics segment about Iran, two different anchors, two different graphics, two different conversations. But when you place these two events side by side, something strange appears, a pattern that looks less like strength and more like distraction, a pattern that looks less like a plan and more like a performance. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand the relationship between the United States and Iran, because it did not start this year. It stretches back generations through revolutions, hostage crises, broken agreements, and decades of sanctions layered one on top of another. Every American administration for the last several decades has tried some version of pressure against Iran. Some tried military threats. Some tried diplomacy. Some tried isolation. Almost none of them achieved the clean, decisive outcome they promised the public. That long history matters here, because it tells us this is not a fresh idea being tested for the first time. It is an old idea being repeated one more time, dressed up in dramatic new language. Let's start with the official story, the one being repeated everywhere. The story says the United States is squeezing Iran's economy so hard that Iran will have no choice but to return to the negotiating table and accept new terms. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. Pressure a country economically, and eventually it bends. That has worked before, in other places, in other decades. But look closer at how this announcement was actually made, and the story starts to crack. First, there were no real details. A campaign described as the harshest in history was announced without a single document attached to it. No formal order signed at that moment. No list of specific targets released to the public. The finance minister had to schedule a separate meeting days later just to explain what the plan even was. Think about that. If a general announces a massive invasion, the soldiers are already moving before the announcement is even finished. Here, the words came first, and the substance had to be assembled afterward. That is not how real power operates. That is how image is built. Second, there was a strange silence about military force. In the weeks before this, the American administration had gone back and forth between threats of devastating military strikes and quiet hints about diplomacy. But when this new economic plan was unveiled, there was no mention of military strength at all. No warning about airstrikes. No mention of naval power, just economic language. Ask yourself why. When someone actually holds a strong hand, they rarely need to shout about it. The strength speaks for itself. When all you have left is loud language, that usually means the quiet options have already run out. Think of it like a negotiation at a car dealership. The buyer who genuinely has other options waiting outside barely needs to raise their voice. The buyer who has nowhere else to go is often the one who suddenly gets loud, dramatic, and insistent, because volume is the only leverage left when the real leverage has already disappeared. Third, and this is the detail almost nobody talks about, the loudest parts of this announcement were written in a way that seemed designed for one particular audience. Not foreign ministries, not international markets, American voters. And fourth, just one day before this dramatic declaration, a senior member of the president's own family had told reporters that private back-channel talks with Iran were moving forward, in his words, very strongly and very productively. Then, less than 24 hours later, the president publicly denied that any negotiations were happening at all. That is not a simple mix-up. That is not two people accidentally saying different things. When you thread threats and denials together this closely, you create total confusion about what the real goal even is. Analysts have a name for this kind of tactic. They call it strategic confusion, a deliberate fog thrown over the situation so no one, not even your own allies, can pin down your true intention. And here's the important part. A foreign government does not usually get confused by a social media post. Foreign governments read intelligence reports, satellite data, military movements. They do not build their strategy around a headline. So if this confusing messaging was not meant to shape Iran's behavior, who was it meant to shape? The answer keeps pointing back home to millions of voters watching the news before an election that is only months away. To understand why this matters so much, we need to look at three separate layers happening at the exact same time, layers that rarely get placed next to each other. The first layer is the actual balance of power on the ground. The second layer is what history tells us about powerful nations reaching their limits. And the third layer is the pure logic of decision-making under pressure, the kind used in negotiations and conflict everywhere. Let's take the first layer. What real tools does economic pressure actually have left to use against Iran? Since the late 1970s, the United States has issued dozens of executive orders against Iran. Multiple laws passed by Congress target it directly. Hundreds of separate sanctions programs already exist. Almost every possible transaction connected to the American financial system involving Iran has already been blocked, reblocked, and blocked again. Legal experts have pointed out that without a full resolution from the United Nations Security Council, no single country can legally impose a complete global embargo alone. And that kind of full international agreement simply does not exist right now. So what is actually left to threaten? In practice, the main new tool is punishing other countries for continuing to trade with Iran, especially the country buying the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil. But here is the part that quietly breaks the entire plan. Over the last several years, Iran has built something that most casual viewers of the news have never heard about, a massive fleet of unmarked oil tankers, ships that turn off their tracking signals, ships that swap their flags, ships built specifically to disappear from official records. A few years ago, this fleet was small, maybe a few dozen vessels. Today, it has grown into the hundreds. And where does that oil actually go? Not through American banks, not through systems that Washington can touch. It moves quietly into small, independent refineries that have almost no exposure to the American financial system at all. You cannot punish a transaction that never touches your currency or your banks in the first place. It is like trying to fine someone for breaking a rule in a game they are not even playing. Picture it this way. Imagine building a wall around every door of a house, every window, every entry point you can think of. Then imagine the person inside quietly digs a tunnel underground that goes around the entire wall. You can keep reinforcing the wall for years, but if the tunnel already exists and keeps expanding, the wall was never really the obstacle it appeared to be. That is close to what has happened here. The wall of sanctions is real, thick, and constantly reinforced. But the tunnel underneath it, built patiently over years, has grown large enough to carry a meaningful share of the traffic the wall was supposed to stop completely. One respected analyst inside Iran has given this entire American strategy a name that captures it perfectly. He calls it the slow squeeze, describing it like a giant snake wrapping tighter and tighter around its prey, hoping that patience alone will eventually cause collapse. But he adds something even sharper. He says the country, applying this pressure, is now trapped in a situation it cannot win and cannot walk away from either. That is not a comment from a rival government trying to score points. That is an outside observer simply describing what the pattern actually looks like. There is another detail that deserves far more attention than it has received. While the American economic announcement was dominating headlines, a senior Iranian political figure was traveling, not staying home to defend against the pressure, but actively meeting with officials in a neighboring country. And the message delivered there was blunt. A critical global shipping route would remain restricted until specific demands were met, including the release of frozen funds and an end to certain military restrictions. The photograph released afterward showed this official standing with a map of the surrounding waters clearly visible behind him. That image was not an accident. Think about the logic here. One side is using economic pressure as its weapon. The other side is using control over a vital shipping route as its counterweight. But here is the imbalance that changes everything. Restricting that route does not just hurt one country's oil exports. It threatens the flow of energy for the entire world. Nations far outside this conflict have already spoken out, demanding the routes stay open because the disruption reaches their economies too. A pressure campaign meant to isolate one country is instead creating friction with allies who are supposed to be standing beside the ones applying that pressure. If you are still with me, that means you actually care about understanding the full picture instead of just skimming headlines. So do me a quick favor. Drop one word in the comments right now, just the word layers. So I know how many of you are following this deeply enough to get to the real analysis. It helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now let's keep going. So the first layer tells us something important. The technical tools needed to make this kind of pressure actually work do not fully exist anymore, which raises an obvious question. If the tools are this limited, Why launch the campaign with such dramatic language in the first place? That brings us to the second layer, the pattern historians recognize in powerful nations under strain. The debt milestone we mentioned earlier did not appear out of nowhere. Some of it directly traces back to lost revenue from trade policies that were later overturned in court, forcing the government to borrow even faster just to keep basic operations running. Researchers who study the long-term rise and fall of powerful nations describe a pattern where, as a dominant power weakens internally, its leadership tends to produce more dramatic, high-stakes public displays. Not because the situation calls for it, but because internal political survival demands it. Leaders under this kind of pressure often need visible, aggressive gestures just to hold on to authority, even when those gestures do not actually solve anything. That is a crucial distinction. The dramatic language is not always a sign of new strength. Sometimes it is exactly the opposite. It shows up precisely when the stronger, quieter tools have already been exhausted. There have also been reports, discussed elsewhere in detail, that after months of intense military operations, supplies of certain precision weapons had become seriously limited. Sustaining the pace of the early months of conflict was becoming difficult. If that is true, then shifting toward economic language instead of military language is not an upgrade in strategy. It is a retreat disguised as toughness. As one Iranian official put it plainly, when the military approach failed to produce results, a new front had to be given a name, and that new front is economic warfare. Even voices from inside the American foreign policy world have echoed this same idea. A former senior State Department official, who once worked directly on Iran policy, summarized the entire campaign with a single sharp sentence. She said the country still has tools, but tools are not automatically the same thing as a strategy. That distinction deserves to be repeated. Having options left in a toolbox does not mean you have a coherent plan for using them. Now we reach the third layer, the one tied to the political calendar back home. There is a major election coming in a matter of months, and control of Congress is genuinely at risk for the ruling party. This pressure is not only visible in public opinion polls, it is visible in blunt public statements from senior lawmakers, including senior figures on intelligence committees, publicly questioning when this conflict will actually end. When senior officials inside your own government start asking that question out loud, this is no longer simple political sniping from the opposition. This is a sign of exhaustion from within the system itself. Everyday citizens are dealing with higher prices at the pump, higher prices at the grocery store, record national debt, and a foreign conflict with no visible resolution in sight. In moments like this, leaders often look for what political scientists describe as a unifying moment, a dramatic display that consolidates public support right before people go vote. A big economic announcement wrapped in historic language fits that need perfectly. It creates the feeling of decisive action, whether or not decisive action is actually happening underneath. There is also a scheduling detail that rarely gets mentioned, but changes the entire calculation. In the coming weeks, a high-level meeting is planned between American leadership and the leadership of the very country that buys most of the oil moving through that hidden tanker fleet. That relationship is already fragile, balanced on a delicate trade truce that both sides need to protect. American industries, including sensitive defense and technology sectors, depend heavily on materials that country controls the supply of. If the harshest financial penalties were actually enforced against that country's banks before this meeting takes place, it would not just strain the relationship, it could collapse it entirely and hand the other side a powerful reason to restrict access to materials that cannot easily be replaced elsewhere. That single scheduling conflict creates a window, a real window, during which the harshest threats simply cannot be made operational without causing damage far beyond the original target. And everyone involved, including Iran, appears to understand that window exists. And there is one more historical detail worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The date this dramatic announcement was made lines up almost exactly with the anniversary of a covert operation more than 7 decades earlier, one where foreign intelligence agencies helped remove Iran's own elected leader from power. The reason that leader was targeted back then was simple. He had decided his country's oil belonged to his own people, not to outside companies. More than 70 years later, oil is once again sitting at the very center of the pressure being applied. History does not just repeat by coincidence sometimes. Occasionally it lines up with an accuracy that feels almost deliberate. If this pattern, a powerful nation stretched thin, resources running low, an election on the horizon, and pressure being placed on reluctant partners who do not fully believe in the plan, sounds familiar, it should. We have seen very similar patterns before in other periods of history, when ambitious campaigns collapsed under their own weight because they underestimated the opponent, ignored the concerns of allies, and confused loud declarations with real strategy. History rarely repeats itself in a perfectly identical way, but it does tend to rhyme in structure. A dominant power, confident that one more dramatic push will finally force an opponent to surrender, often misjudges exactly how much that opponent has already adapted to years of pressure. The opponent, meanwhile, has usually spent that same stretch of time quietly building workarounds, alliances, and hidden capacity that never show up in the headlines until the moment they are needed. That gap between what the dominant power believes and what has actually been built in the shadows is where most of these campaigns eventually go wrong. And there is a second recurring detail worth noticing. These dramatic campaigns are almost never launched from a position of comfort. They tend to appear at the exact moment when the original plan has already stalled, when the first strategy quietly failed to deliver the promised result, and a new, louder front is needed to change the subject. A confident power does not usually need a rebrand. A struggling one often does. I want to be completely fair here, though, because a serious analysis has to consider the strongest version of the opposing argument, not just the weakest one. So let's steelman it. If someone wanted to argue that this pressure campaign really is working, here is the strongest case they could make. The economic damage is real. Officials inside Iran's own central banking system have publicly admitted that oil exports through official, traceable channels have effectively dropped to almost nothing. Foreign currency reserves held outside the country remain frozen. Import capacity is strained. Unemployment among younger citizens is climbing. The cost of post-conflict rebuilding is enormous. And a fuel shortage inside the country is not a rumor, officials there have openly called. Hit an extremely serious problem, with long lines forming at fuel stations and people rushing to stockpile whatever they can. None of that is invented. None of it should be waved away just because it does not fit neatly into the argument being made here. A serious analysis has to sit with the uncomfortable evidence, not skip past it. Ordinary families are dealing with real shortages. Ordinary businesses are dealing with real restrictions. If someone tells you the pressure campaign has produced zero effect at all, they are not being careful. They are just telling you a more comfortable version of the story. So, if official exports have collapsed, how is oil still reaching international buyers at all? The answer, again, is that hidden fleet of unmarked tankers. A meaningful amount of oil, though far less than before, is still moving through those disguised ships into refineries that sit completely outside the reach of Western financial systems. Both things are true at once. The pressure is real, and the workaround is also real. The squeeze is genuine, but it is not total. Quick pause. If you have made it this far, you are clearly not someone who just watches the first 2 minutes and leaves. So here is a small challenge instead of the usual ask. Before you keep watching, tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next video in this series will test every single prediction you are about to hear. And I want you here when we check the results. All right, let's finish this. So where might this entire analysis be wrong? Here is the honest answer. The pressure clearly does produce an effect. What is far less certain is whether the effect it produces is the one it was designed to create. A former negotiator who has actually sat across the table during past talks with Iranian officials explained something important about how Iranian leadership tends to respond to existential threats. Under direct, aggressive pressure, leadership there historically does not respond with quiet compromise. Backing down under attack is viewed internally as a dangerous signal of weakness, one that would only invite even more pressure in the future. Instead, the far more likely response is counter-escalation, potentially including direct action to break any blockade, potentially targeting energy infrastructure belonging to nearby allied nations. This is sometimes described by scholars as a completely different value system around sacrifice and resistance, one where yielding under maximum pressure is treated as structurally impossible, because giving in would prove that pressure works, and that would only guarantee more pressure. Keeps coming. The natural outcome of that mindset is not surrender, it is escalation. And there are already signs pointing in that exact direction. Diplomatic sources close to the situation have hinted that something significant is being prepared, some kind of surprise response still being finalized behind closed doors. Meanwhile, financial groundwork is quietly being built to soften the blow of continued sanctions, agreements to clear banking barriers with a neighboring country, discussions about joining alternative development banks outside the traditional Western financial system, small trade deals signed with distant partner nations that hint at a much larger long-term goal, building financial pathways that do not depend on the American dollar at all. Here lies the real irony hiding underneath this entire situation. Instead of breaking the target economy, the pressure campaign may actually be speeding up the construction of an alternative financial system built specifically to survive without needing the dollar at all. The very tool being used to enforce control might end up accelerating the erosion of that same control over the long run. I want to make a few predictions here, ones you can hold me accountable to later. Save this video, come back in a few months, and let's see how many of them held up. First, the harshest financial penalties threatened against major trading partners will likely remain more talk than action. because fully enforcing them would risk damaging other delicate diplomatic relationships that both sides still need intact. Second, expect some kind of announced military or technological surprise from Iran within the coming weeks, because the language coming from their own military leadership already hints at something new being prepared. Third, watch for a real, concrete step forward in that alternative financial system, some tangible milestone that shows this is not just talk anymore. And fourth, expect the entire conversation around this conflict to shift more and more toward domestic politics back home as the election gets closer, because the pressure building internally may end up outweighing anything being applied externally. And fifth, watch for at least one unexpected regional partner, a country currently sitting on the sidelines to quietly shift its position in the coming weeks, either toward open cooperation or open resistance, because a standoff this unstable rarely lets neutral parties stay neutral for long. Let's come back now to where we started, a record-breaking debt milestone, a dramatic economic declaration made the very same week, and a historical anniversary tied to oil and foreign intervention that lines up with an accuracy that feels almost too precise to be coincidence. To be absolutely clear, none of this means the story is over, and none of this means one side has already lost. Deep institutional strength, financial reserve status, and military reach do not disappear overnight, even during a period of visible strain. But the pattern of behavior on display here, underestimating an opponent's resilience, pressuring reluctant partners without their full support, watching alliances quietly fracture under the weight of mismatched goals, and using a dramatic new front to disguise exhaustion on the original one, this is a pattern history has shown us again and again. And it is rarely, if ever, the signature of a side that is winning from a position of strength. It is far more often the signature of a side running out of options and trying to make that shortage look like a plan. The people saying this out loud are not outside critics looking to score political points. They are former negotiators, former State Department officials, sitting senators on intelligence committees, people who spent their careers inside the very system now applying this pressure, and they are all reading the exact same warning signs. That should make you pause. It is one thing when a critic on the outside says a policy is failing. It is another thing entirely when the people who built the machine, the people who once sat in the room where these decisions were made, start describing it in the exact same language as its harshest outside critics. When insiders and outsiders start telling the same story, that is usually the moment a pattern stops being a theory and starts being a fact, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to it. So here is the real question, hiding underneath everything we just walked through. This moment is not really about whether Iran breaks under pressure. It never was. The real question is whether the side applying that pressure can find a way out of its own trap before the election arrives, before the fragile diplomatic meetings scheduled in the coming weeks, before whatever surprise Iran may already be preparing behind closed doors. Whoever gets to control the story of how this ends will control how history remembers it. And right now, that story is still being written in real time. Every empire in history believed, right up until the moment it did not, that one more push, one more dramatic display, one more headline-grabbing declaration would finally settle things in its favor. Most of the time, that final push was not the beginning of victory. It was the clearest signal yet that the real strength had already quietly run out somewhere behind the scenes. Whether that pattern is repeating here is not something any single video can prove with total certainty, but the signs are lining up in a way that is very hard to ignore and very easy to test against whatever happens next. So watch what actually happens over the coming weeks, not what gets announced, what actually happens. Watch whether the harshest penalties get enforced or quietly delayed. Watch whether the shipping routes reopen or stay closed. Watch whether the election season language gets louder as the vote gets closer. Watch whether the surprise Iran seems to be preparing actually arrives. And if it does, watch how quickly the tone in Washington changes once it does. That is where the real answer will show up, not in a single dramatic post written in capital letters,